to the BroDiallo book review. I'm a BroDiallo, and the book we're doing today is actually a book I wedged into our book review schedule because I was going to do Amos Wilson, Black on Black Violence, the Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation in Service to White Supremacy, but then I thought to myself, I can't really go in on black violence without first talking about white on black violence, which is the progenitor, which is the provocation, which is what profits, which created the conditions and reality of black on black violence. So I didn't want to appear, which I've been accused of being insensitive to the struggles of the brothers in the streets, the black gangbangers, and the other black on black reactionary criminal predatory element without acknowledging that I understand the larger power dynamics and social hierarchies that create and feed and perpetuate black on black violence and ultimately profit from black on black violence. So, saying all that to say, this is why we're going to do black on black violence after we talk about white on black violence. And there are many books, very good books, like The Psychopathic Racial Personality by Dr. Bobby Wright, or Yurugu by Dr. Marimba Aini. There are a lot of really good books written from a Pan-African or an African-centered perspective talking about white violence. But I decided to start with a takes one to know one approach, which is a white man talking about white folks, which I like to do that. I like to get perspectives from the people that I'm talking about or from their academics or their communities. Anyway, so that's why if you were expecting Amos Wilson's Black on Black Violence, that will come after this. But if you're watching this and you've already seen it, then that's fine too. It's not necessarily a mandate, but that's just a little caveat. But let's proceed. We're reviewing today The Iceman Inheritance, Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression, written by Michael Bradley, and the intro was actually by Dr. John Henry Clarke. Well, at least the version that I have. This is the only version I'm familiar with, but I know there are other versions or volumes of this. But the introduction by Dr. John Henry Clarke, which gives it a lot of weight, a lot of legitimacy from my point of view, if you know the scholarship of Dr. Clarke, for a book written by a Canadian, a white man, a man from a genocidal settler state, talking about European aggression and genocide. So it was first published in 1978 by Cato Publishing, and again, Michael Bradley, who was a scholar and I think he was a scholar in anthropology originally, but he also studies history and cultures. So anyway, let's just get into the text. Or as Wise Intelligence said when I saw him in a concert one time, let's just get through this, because this is pretty heavy. And I think that this should be required reading on anyone who is interested in challenging or even understanding. And in fact, we have to accept there are a lot of people who want to understand racism and white domination but have no intent on subverting or challenging it. A lot of black people actually study or understand the system from capitalism to U.S. politics so that they can elevate or extract more personal wealth from it, but have no intention on challenging it. But if you are a true person who wants to challenge systems and institutions of global white domination, this book should be on your required reading list. So now we start. This is like our fourth start, but bear with me. Chapter 1, Greek Gifts, Western Technology. He talks about racism as the predisposition of the white race, which is a pretty bold statement to start your book with, saying that the only population or the only identifiable group of humanity that engages in racism are white folks. And it's been an ongoing online debate asserting that black people can't be racist, and a lot of white people trying to, with persecution complexes, talking about Black Lives Matter, what about white lives? So back decades ago, this is an ongoing debate, but I agree with him that the white race are the cultivators and the maintainers and solely responsible for any concept that you have, modern concept of racism and racial superiority and racial discrimination, even though we can find from India to Saudi Arabia to Asia places where now non-white people engage in racist policies, racist attitudes, and racial discrimination. But it if you follow any of those formerly colonized or currently colonized or non-white or off-white populations, if you follow their history of racism or racial discrimination, much of it leads back, if not all of it leads back to the white race or Aryan culture or Western culture in concept. He states that white impacts, or what are some byproducts of white racism, is nuclear war, environmental pollution, resource rape, climate change. And these are some of the life-ending behaviors that are born out of what I would call, or what Dr. Bobby Wright calls, the psychopathic racial personality, but in this text he calls the Iceman's inheritance or mentality or culture. Some defense mechanism that the white race has developed to challenge these very serious accusations are denial of race, and he says that denial of race is permeating, back in '78, modern liberal anthropology, where they try to have a post-racial or a non-racial, I don't see color point of view or ideology. And then they also say that progress as vindication, saying, well, despite all of the genocide, all the colonization, all of the mass extinction, all of the environmental destruction, how can you condemn it when you have so much progress? Progress in medicine, progress in technology, the technology that I'm using to communicate. So this was a fair trade-off, or even an inevitable outcome of progress. Of course, the book argues that you didn't need it. He also talks a bit, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, about how other societies had advanced comparable technologies to Europe at the time of the European expansion, whereas you could even argue that European domination of the world has, if not warped, slowed or diverted human progress in a manner that harms more people or creates more harm for humanity and all other living things than it does good. So Western technology is not a good trade-off, or European or Western progress or scientific progress is not an equitable trade-off for nuclear contamination of the planet and the threat of nuclear holocaust, environmental pollution, ecocide, resource rape, and climate change. And in those white impacts, he doesn't even talk about the human impacts of genocide, colonization, extermination, loss, or warping of native or non-white culture. He also talks in chapter 2 on Greek gifts of Western philosophy and the domination of Western philosophy. He goes on further into progress and states that our progress has succeeded in blanketing the entire world in a dreary, anti-human monoculture, which consists of very real threats to human survival as well as ugliness. So, even Michael Bradley, a product of and a member of the white race in Western culture, says that if we really took a sober step back and we got away from the media, the marketing, and the promotion of Western progress and all the products that are promoted to us, we'll see that it is a very poor trade-off. In chapter 2, he also talks about, which is so interesting, because when you talk about white aggression, almost a conditioned response is that people will want to talk like, well, Africans had slavery and Asians went to war. What about Genghis Khan and all these other, or the human sacrifice of the Aztecs and Mesoamerican warfare. So he makes a point to say that European or white Western man's violence is different. They have what he calls normal violence and abnormal violence. And normal violence is the type of violence, the provocations for violence that are present in all human population, all human cultures, which is population expansion. As your population grows, you need to expand territory. So population expansion also internally breeds conflict. Migration breeds conflict. A lot of times you might have a pastoral or animal husbandry centric culture comes against an agricultural or nomadic culture, comes into contact with a nomadic culture. Those are normal causes of violence you find across culture. They're universal forms. And another thing is tyrants and conquerors. All races have produced their Genghis Khans, their Shaka Zulus, and their conquerors and tyrants. That is not unique to Europeans. He also called it the empire and ego um, um, proclivity found among some individuals or in some cultures. He calls those normal violence, and what makes them normal is not necessarily that they're healthy, that they're not damaging, but you can find them across cultures. But he said abnormal violence that are unique to Caucasoids is philosophical conflict, killing somebody because they have a different idea or view or conclusion or a different way of structuring their hierarchies, killing somebody based on philosophical ideas and going to war, waging multi-generational genocidal wars based on philosophical conflicts. You don't find that in other culture. Religious conflict, where even every war might have, well, this particular tribe or this particular religious or spiritual group goes to war with this other group, but if you look outside of Europe, that's never purely, it's always also based on population expansion, migration, and tyrants, but purely religious wars are unique to Caucasoids. And finally, intellectual violence. So non-material motivations and non-material justifications for violence, he says, are unique to Caucasoids. Another quote from the text: our wart of religion, our inquisition, our philosophical conflicts have no parallel amongst yellow, red, brown, or black men. It is the kind of violence that makes our history appear senseless to other men and senseless and baffling to ourselves. So that is something that we should watch for, especially in a time where we live in the United States and Republicans and Democrats in the United States are talking about a civil war and mass murder and even bringing about the downfall of their own empire based on conflicts between two political parties that ultimately on 90% of all issues they completely agree upon. So this, even in this modern era, for back to the for the earliest manifestations of European philosophy and religion to now, these conflicts still abound. These immaterial conflicts based on philosophy, intellect, and religious. And he also stated that Western culture is inapplicable, irrelevant, and unsatisfying to non-Caucasoids, which was another interesting segment of the text, because you see so many people have had Western culture imposed on them, and you see wealthy black people who can afford the best that Western culture has to offer, and there always seems to be this void or this emptiness, or these people who come in our communities and sell us wealth and getting money and establishing ourselves within our oppressors' culture, and we see the madness born out of. A lot of us look at it as just tabloid fodder, from the Jackson family to the Serena Williams, that these wealthy and established black people literally go insane. It's because the more access you have to white folks, or as Muda Baruka said poetically, it's not good to stay in a white man country too long. And he said it's not good for an African mind, an African mentality, to be subjected to Western culture without any type of filters or unrelenting filters for too long. But going on in that same chapter, he talks about the Chronos complex, which is man attempting to treat time like we treat physical space and social position, non-biological past-future communication, which is mostly present in religion and writing. The Chronos complex, treating time like a commodity or a physical thing that we can possess, control, or dwell within. A lot of that ties back to colored people time versus white people time, and most European anthropologists, when they went into the non-white world, talked about how non-white people dealt with time and their concept of time and the progression of time and doing things in a timely manner. And even colonizers were often frustrated with their newly colonized workers and slaves because they say we were lazy because we didn't work on a clock and the clock didn't control or dictate our movements, and which made it hard to exploit us and made it even harder to extract profit from our labor. But due to Western propaganda and Western imperialism, now we have black folks who also have that or promote that Chronos complex. I don't sleep, I get the work done, being on time, and things of that nature. But I continue. There's also the concept of surpassing the past and limiting the future. Whereas Europeans want to do better than their ancestors, and they set up conditions where their descendants can't proceed beyond where they do. They handicap their descendants, which is another psychopathic thing. And a lot of things that are discussed in the Iceman's Inheritance point out things that have become normalized or become so predominant in our lives we don't even recognize it. So look for progress to surpass the past and dominance, how Europeans, especially elite and wealthy Europeans, use their inheritance or property that they pass on to generation, and it's often seen as something not so much celebrated, but it's something that creates a lot of conflict and anxiety. They are in perpetual state of war, and one thing that war is known for amongst all the other crimes is that it destroys the future. Young people fight the war, and the young people who survive the war are severely damaged. And you look at all the European conflicts from Vietnam going back to the Crusades, they had whole generations lost. And the warriors who fought those wars come back and feel like they have no place in society. So we have to look for instances in the past and the future of the European or the Iceman's concept of surpassing, constant progress, modernization, abandoning the past, but they want to cripple and handicap the future. This is also seen in objectivism. The world didn't matter before you were born, and the world ends after you die as an individual. That's found in Randian or the philosophy of objectivism by Ayn Rand. I think Donald Trump is one of the best modern manifestations of this sick mentality. But we have to move on. The book also states nuclear weapons, rampant technology, environmental pollution, resource impoverishment are all results of an extreme Chronos complex. They belong at the white man's doorstep. I think that statement stands on its own. Let's keep moving. We are human. But in perspective of the entire population, this is also Bradley speaking for himself. We are, which are white people, are human. But in the perspective of the entire human population, we are a pathology. We are abnormal, atypical man. This is also articulated by modern philosophers like Tom Hartman, who said that European history is the history of a virus, how a virus would act on an individual, invading the body, weakening and destroying the very host that it needs to live, or a parasite. Europeans have acted that way on a planetary scale. Again, this is all white folks. I'm going to try to keep talking about white folks, talking about other white folks before I go into black to talk about black on black violence. Going on. In chapter 3, he talks about the child of ice and fire, where he tries to get into the origins of white people and the very concept of whiteness, and explain white dominance of the world. And this, we're coming up on my absolute favorite quote of the book. But 3 major points from chapter 3 is that there is no evidence of innate intelligence differing amongst races, meaning that there is no scientific confirmation that any other race has more intellectual ability or potential than any other race. Glacial evolution is unique to Caucasians. That's the 3rd point we have to remember. All other races or cultures, even if they came like the Inuit or the Eskimo people came to live in extreme environments through migration, all of their initial evolution and development happened outside of the glacial or frigid areas, except for Europeans. And 3, their behavior is a byproduct, or European behavior is a byproduct of glacial adaptation. So that is what makes them unique. And then in, again, my favorite quote from the text, where he's talking about how do white people come to rule the world? How did white hegemony become a thing? And he states, not intelligence, nor morality, nor spirit, but aggression is responsible for the white man's quote-unquote superiority. Aggression is responsible for the expansion of Caucasoids, both geographically and culturally, at the expense of other races. And that's it at a hands down. He also goes on to state, when the Worm Glacier or Worm Ice Age release the white race from its tutelage under fire and ice is when the pathological temporal aggression was unleashed upon the world. So the world became a new place and subject to something it never experienced before at the receding of the Worm Glacier or the Worm Ice Age. In the concept, in his notes on superiority, he states that superiority is never internal. Your superiority is dictated by external conditions. Or let's just take something out of the realm of race. Let's say basketball. Michael Jordan is a superior basketball player. And the only thing that's noteworthy is because this is a society that values or has been indoctrinated to value basketball skills. But in a society that didn't have basketball, Michael Jordan's superiority would be all but irrelevant. Or in a society that devalued sports altogether or put up soccer or cricket or sports that are almost all but alien in the United States, Michael Jordan's superiority or dominance is relevant to the conditions that he was born into and what the society's value. So superiority is not, even if you have a superior skill that makes you better than anyone else at a particular thing. I could be the best butter churner in the world, but no one churns butter anymore. So my superiority is all but irrelevant and thus non-existent. But it's dictated by external conditions. So white people having control over external conditions that we need to live is what grants them their so-called superiority over other people, not anything they were born with or innate to them. Nothing is innate about racial superiority or inferiority, which I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but this book is it's chock so full of so much insights. And thirdly, on superiority, white superiority peaked at the dawn of World War II and has been in steady decline since, then moving whites to a status of inferiority, which is a very interesting point of view, especially if you are born in this modern era, you live in this modern era where it still seems like white hegemony, white power, white domination is all pervasive. But if you look at the sun never setting on the British Empire, if you look at European imperialism, if you look at the power from the African continent and the decolonization struggles, Latin America and the non-alignment struggles, and the Caribbean, and you look at the rise of China, and you look at India and how the economic fulcrum or the economic nucleus of the world is shifting east, you'll find that the system of white domination has been eroding since World War II, since they fought their last big murder orgy that they tried to triumphantly tell us was a great war against fascism when it was fascist versus fascist. I love to say, because it's true, that the Nazis military lost the war, but the Nazi ideology won the war. Look up Operation Paperclip if you really think World War II was an anti-Nazi. But I digress, and I'm getting off. So that's something to give us hope, but again, also in the text, he talks about how the life-sustaining capacity, my words, not his, but basically he points out how the ability for us to even live and survive on the planet through growing food and having shelter and navigating the climate is being destroyed. So there's this race between the natural devolution or the natural erosion of white power and the planet's ability to sustain our lives. So we can't just sit back and relax and say, well, we know white power or white supremacy peaked in the World War II and it's declining, but so is the life-sustaining capacity of the planet is also declining because they still have a significant amount of power and it's eroding too slowly. So we have to do what we can do to accelerate this process. He goes on to talk about in part 2, chapter 4, race in the Neanderthal Caucasoids and the concept of race. Bradley states that it seems that of all races, white people have been inordinately concerned with the pro or con of racial differences and their possible social or biological differences. All races, long before there was any such thing as a white man or European or Western culture, cultures that are centuries older, civilizations and races that are centuries older than a European, recognized that there were differences in how people look. You find ancient texts and people would describe people with facial features, skin color, and hair textures, as well as how they dressed, how they communicated languages. But no other race was so preoccupied with how those phenotypical or physical or surface differences determine the value or better or worse status or hierarchy of people than the white race. And there are some people who mythologically say that capitalism created racism. White people invented racism in order to justify slavery. But if you go as far back prior to the Ma'afa or African enslavement by Europeans, if you go back further, you'll find that the Greeks, the Romans, the Vikings, they all had hostile concepts of people that had different skin color, hair texture, facial features, phenotypes in them. So capitalism is a byproduct of racism and white aggression, but it is not the source of it. So we can get you, and we also have evidence, the rise of European socialism, they were all racist. You can't find any socialist organizations. The socialists and white anarchists are better at acknowledging and challenging racism within their ranks, but they've always been present, from the IWW to the Bolshevik Revolution. But we're getting short on time, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace here in the concept of race. I'm going to try to pick up the pace. So I want to start keeping these under an hour, preferably 35 to 45 minutes. But he talks about some of the best known racial philosophers coming out of the Western school of thought and Western academics. One individual he talks about is Carl Linnaeus, who is credited with founding the animal classification. He intentionally grouped humans as one species. In 1785, he wanted to say, well, all humans are one species. So he was not keen on racial division of humans. He did divide humanity into 6 varieties of human species: Europeanus, his word, not mine, Europeanus, Asiaticus, Americanus, and Afar, being the major groups. And each of those groups, European, Asians, Mesoamerica, or the New World Americas, and the Africans, or the Afars, were the major groups, and each of those groups had subgroups. But in 1949, a man by the name of Buffon introduced race into scientific literature, and race meant kind or variety. In 1775, John Frederick Blumenbach, I'm sure that's how it's pronounced, began to attribute specific temperamental and mental differences to the varied human species, which is Blumenbach is the, I think, uncredited father of scientific racism as we understand it today. I can hear feedback from your headphones. Oh, Roma, I can hear your headphones. Okay, and so, but the king, the true father of anti-race theories is Montesquieu. And racism, according to Montesquieu, was justified. He argued that race was invented for the justification of slave economics and the erroneous assumptions of systems of classification. Now, again, as I stated, this is not consistent with all of European history, that these are modern manifestations, people who wrote the concepts down. But if we observe European behavior or Western man's aggression, we'll see that all of the behaviors that happened under the classification or the modern language of race and racism, all of those behaviors predate the language and the scientific justification. And in racism and slavery, it's also seen that Europeans, which, again, to say that white aggression and white oppression and white discrimination and genocide is independent of their feelings about or their beliefs about inferiority, we can look at the first contacts that the historian Vasco da Gama stated that Europeans' first contacts with Africans, they called Africans or Africa long of good people. They said that Africans were good, noble, and just people. The first contact with the Amerindians said that Native Americans excelled, had excellent acute understanding, loving, uncovetous, and docile. Christopher Columbus said this. Let me say it again. They were excellent, acute at understanding. They were good. They were intelligent, loving, uncovetous, and docile, peaceful people. Columbus said this. Europeans didn't start, modern Europeans or in the making of the modern world, didn't start calling Africans and Americans savages until the 1640s. And it even said that in the 1640s that the savagery of the Africans and the Europeans was not as severe, and the average African and Native American was more civil and intelligent than the average white peasant. So, and this was stated by Father Lejeune. So in the 1700s, blacks goes from, in the 1600s, black Africans between the 16 and 1700s, we go from being good people, excellent, intellectual, loving, uncovetous, docile, and even better in our behavior, more civil and intelligent than the average white person. By the early 1700s, all blacks and natives were lazy, filthy pagans, bestial morals, no better than dogs, only fit for slavery. So this is not anything tied to just our skin color. This is tied to a defect in the European mentality. Not anything they observed or anything they acknowledged was present in our culture prior to, during, or after European introduction and engagement. He goes further into talk specifically about the Neanderthal Caucasoid and their material adaptation of the Caucasoids, and how the ability to survive a glacial culture and a glacial evolution was very well suited for global conquest, but poorly suited for overall human positive or productive or humane or peaceful relations. In chapter 6, he also talks about psychobiology, where he gets deeper into the mind or the mentality of the Iceman. And let's keep going. Chapter 7, well, I don't really have time to cover most of that, but I do have a series of quotes where he also talks about love and expression, which is another very telling, because romantic love has now dominates most of the world, where our concepts of valuing each other and how we love, or what makes one worthy of love and acceptance versus not. And you hear a lot of black folks, we already have our love songs and our concepts of romance and being romantic. But when we look at the origins of this, or where we got this from, it's actually maladaptive or extremely dysfunctional values to place for pair bonding, family or familial or intimate relationships, or parental relationships. And just some quotes. Dr. Bradley states that most of mankind is innocent of anything like the Western notion of love. Whatever it is we mean by love is simply irrelevant to most of mankind. He goes on to say that the Chinese do not even have a word corresponding to love. The ancient Egyptians' two favorite words and concept were Ankh, which meant life, and Djed, which means stability. There is a good deal of uncertainty about whether the ancient Egyptians even possessed anything similar to our idea of love. Goes on to say that love is that middle ground between aggression and the ability to reproduce. Love is that place where we can feel unthreatened in sex, and the place where we can have sex without directing aggression toward our partner. This place is where sex and respect can coexist for ourselves and our partners. Final quote on love. A pair bond, love, is displaced aggression. It is aggression shoved aside, literally, so that the partners can reproduce without threat. Courtship is a subtle process whereby initial and natural aggression is turned aside, so that in the end, the courting partners can stand side by side to face the world with their combined and allied aggression directed outward. Courtship can be lengthy and anxiety-provoking process in the West. Falling in love is more or less traumatic event filled with uncertainties, lovers' quarrels, playful fighting, etc. He goes into this because I think it's important that so many people have been infected with the love is all, love conquers all, love will be the end of all, and there is even people who say that love between or interracial relationships will overcome racism, and when we're all mixed race and we're all able to intermarry and have sex with each other, this will somehow diffuse racial tensions and racial aggression. And basically, um, Bradley states that love, the concept of love, is a adaptation that Europeans invented so that they could set aside their natural aggression long enough to reproduce with one another without destroying each other. And we take this maladaptation and we, due to Western imperialism and cultural imposition, now that we have Africans, our God, Jesus is love, God is love, and we spit this concept. Love is pervasive through all. Love is all, or love will conquer all. So these are some interesting historical criticism or critiques of the concept of love and what other high values such as life and stability that of our ancestors, that they principles or ideas that they held most highly, as opposed to this concept of love. There is so much more to get into. Just scratching the surface. I think this is an excellent book, and I think this is a timely book. I do hope that the ideas in this book are allowed to resurge or reemerge, because it is very, very important that we understand the world, the system that is literally destroying, and the people who control the system and impose the system that is destroying the life-sustaining capacity of the world. He also talks about European technology versus African and Asian technology, and how African and Asian technology was harmonious with nature, whereas European technology is anti-nature, seen as a conquest or opposition to nature. And he talks about goes deeper into reproduction and sexism and sexual dimorphism, where non-European cultures, where the rules and roles and dress and standards for men and women were not that far apart, whereas Europeans have a very high level of what he called sexual dimorphism, where the things that men are allowed to do, wear, say, and how they are function are very, very distant from what women can do, and harsh from stoning, Salem witch trials, where if a woman encroached in a man's space or a male space, she could be murdered or killed, and which is, we think sexism in the modern era is just, sexual harassment or thinking men are better than women, where really European sexism has been deadly for women. And ultimately, everything that Europeans imposed on everyone else, on black people, on Asian people in the New World, from the genocide to the enslavement, Europeans did amongst themselves and imposed on each other before they even knew there were non-white people on the planet. So ultimately, there is no resolution to this that allows a multicultural or peaceful resolution to racism and global white domination, or what he calls global white supremacy. He ultimately states that Europeans will first of all have to come to terms with all of the realities stated in his books and beyond of Western culture, and they will have to pretty much make a deliberate and conscious decision to be other than who they are. And because there is a strong biological component to their behaviors and their worldview or their mentality and practices, that's almost impossible, and that the world has a strong potential of not surviving, or the human species could go extinct, or all life on Earth could go extinct as a failure to acknowledge the Iceman's inheritance and the death cult of Western culture, Western religion, Western economics. And I feel that it's so unfortunate that so many African people have surrendered to the legitimacy of European domination, and that the best thing that we can do as African people is find a comfortable niche. If they set up a capitalist economy instead of subverting capitalism, we say, how do we become the best capitalists? If they set up a militaristic nationalistic, chauvinistic, paternalistic, puritanical culture, then how do we create strong black families that exist in the same idea and concepts of the Western love and Western family structures, as opposed to undermining and subverting this? So it is a very, very timely book, even though it was written decades ago. I think even now that climate change and global warming are advancing so much more aggressively, understanding the death cult or the death urge of Western culture, the illegitimacy of white supremacy, and the all-consuming nature of white aggression. Understanding that will help us structure more sane and rational cures or remedies or countermeasures or defenses against it. So that is, I'm going to stop there. I'm under time. So these book reviews will be shorter, but I'll try to make them also more concise. The points that there's so much more in this relatively short text, just a couple of hundred pages, but it's so dense. He is an anthropologist, and he's just able to really pack this text with so many insights and so many quotables. Again, our next book will be Black on Black Violence by Dr. Amos Wilson, and after that we're going to review Who Stole the Soul by Creamer, which I think those books are also good complements to one another. Thank you for being with us for another review. I'm definitely not going to let so much time pass before reviews. You please support the BroDiallo efforts, the BroDiallo show, which broadcasts every Monday from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. You can go to my Patreon, diallokenyatta.com. If you like this type of content and want to see more of it, if you become a Patreon, you also will receive some appreciation gifts. I also will be hosting a monthly review, a monthly book review, and a monthly progressive or Pan-African media review on that site. So you become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You help me to produce content, and you will have access to some exclusive items and exclusive engagements and interactions for my patrons. I think that's everything. And we will be back ASAP with Black on Black Violence. I'm writing up the notes for that as we speak. Thank you. 41 minutes. I said all that if you weren't listening. And you can put that in there. And it's 41 minutes, so I got in under time. What do you think?